This is the 2024 By Degrees Climate Summit. We are already experiencing climate change. Just in the past year, New England experienced many storms and flood damage from the coast of Maine to the river valleys of Vermont in July, December, January, and in April. These events can, of course, be very painful, but in our response, we can catch glimpses of the future. Writer and climate activist Rebecca Solnit writes, "Disaster offers a view into another world for ourselves." And I really believe that. For example, after Katrina, residents of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans created a structure of mutual aid with their neighbors, sharing food, first aid, and meeting people's needs. And this is the kind of thing we see all the time. We've seen it here in New England. Some of the people on this panel can speak directly to that. And so even though climate change is a catastrophe, it is an opportunity to build systems that work better for all of us. But how? How do we do that? And how do we do it in a sustained and long-term way around climate solutions that could take years? And how do we do that with our neighbors and local governments? So let's ask our panelists about this. We are so excited. I'm so excited to introduce this group. Brianna O'Brien is the conservation coordinator for the town of Hampton, where she focuses on improving the local ecological health and resilience of Hampton, especially its wetlands. Claudia Diaz-Martinez is a policy fellow at the City of Boston's Environment Department, where, among other things, she's focused on helping city staff and its community become carbon neutral by 2050, or the City of Boston become carbon neutral by 2050, and helping leaders prioritize justice and equity. She's also a PhD candidate at Boston University. And Kari White is based in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, where she's the Director of Community Health Equity at Northern Counties Healthcare. After the damage of last July's floods, she also helped co-found and now chairs the Northeast Kingdom Long-Term Recovery Group, Kingdom United Resilience and Recovery Effort. So welcome, let's give them a round of applause, please. So let's start with the topic of this panel. Why are we talking about the local today? A lot of people experience limitations and hurdles that come from getting government assistance in the wake of disasters. Hurricane Sandy is just one example, meaning that community-generated solutions are essential. But why is that? I'd like to hear from each of you, what is something that's happened in your region that couldn't have been done or would have been so much harder without community involvement? Maybe something that even could only have been done coming from the local. Brianna, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah. I think that when we're thinking about the action that we're taking at a local level, we want to be prepared and mitigating disasters, and in the preparedness, we want to have that ahead of the disasters happening. And in Hampton, we have a lot of really amazingly involved residents who have advocated for years for the health of their community, specifically the folks along the coast and who border the marsh. A lot of the priorities that Hampton has really focused on over the past few years wouldn't have happened without their advocacy. In 2014, because of their work and their consistency in showing up to town meetings, and their questioning and their concerns being brought to light repeatedly, the town did some studies, and that led to further studies and eventually became a pretty, at this point, robust priority for the town of Hampton to focus on climate resilience and coastal resilience across most of our departments.
Kari, what about you?
People are feeling desperate, and when a disaster strikes, it just shines a light on the existing disparities and issues that people are dealing with in their day-to-day life. So when there are governmental agencies that come in the wake of a disaster, rightfully so, many of our disenfranchised neighbors are very wary of going into a space, sitting across a table with a person representing the government in a uniform who knows nothing about them, their situation, their family. So regardless of how beneficial those resources might be, the messenger matters.
That's a really good point. Claudia, what about you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Back in Boston, I've been very honored and privileged to be part of what I see as one of the most significant programs that we have in the city to achieve carbon neutrality. And the name of that program is BERDO, which stands for the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, and I won't go into much detail right now. But one of the reasons I feel so much pride to be part of the team that is implementing this program now is that it is one of the few building decarbonization programs of its kind in the United States that has such intentional components for environmental justice, and that not only has explicit goals for justice, but also has very intentional measures to make sure that the implementation of the program is equitable and that our most vulnerable communities in Boston can ultimately benefit from better buildings. And I can say that this program would not exist, or it would not exist in this way if it wasn't for the commitment of a lot of community-based organizations in Boston that put a lot of work throughout the years to have this program in place to have better buildings in the city.
We heard from a listener named Nate who wrote us, when an applicant for a building permit develops engineering plans to account for flooding, they often only need to account for 25-year storm events. We know that 1,000-year storm events now happen every few years. Almost all buildings and development in New Hampshire have been poorly designed to manage stormwater for flooding that occurs increasingly frequently.
It's a really challenging system to navigate, knowing kind of the shortcomings of FEMA's mapping systems and what they account for, and oftentimes when they're released, they're already antiquated because of how dynamic floodplains are, and with the changing climate, there's a lot of nuance to that isn't often captured in those maps, and therefore is not required by building code and by FEMA standards. In Hampton, we have adopted higher standards for our building requirements, and they allow for more freeboard depending on the type of structure. So freeboard being how much higher above the base flood elevation a building has to be built to. Certain stormwater management requirements. So it was actually a really great kind of dynamic community. There was community involvement. There was a lot of stakeholders involved in these conversations as we discussed what that ordinance update would look like, and we were able to evaluate different options and what made the most sense for what, kind of where we were at as a community. And so that was adopted, I think it was this spring, and so we're looking at much more resilient structures moving forward, if new structures or substantially improved structures.
I'd like to turn now to a super sexy subject that I think that we'll all know what I'm about to say, which is municipal budgets and their role in setting climate priorities in our backyards. It actually is fascinating, Claudia. You wrote a paper about this, published in the journal Nature, and you argue that municipal finance should be thought of as a, quote, set of ethical and political choices that can be used to move forward on climate action and justice. What do you mean by that?
When you think about it, municipal finance is in the end a reflection of what we value as a society. So we're saying this is what it's worth investing our money in, this is what we value, this is what we think is the best for us in the future. And cities, towns can have a lot of climate goals and all of these targets and beautiful commitments, but in the end, if the money is not put into climate action, it is likely that nothing would happen or not that much will happen. So that paper, I really want people to, become more curious about things that sound so boring, like municipal budgets or, revolving funds and where their city is putting money. And we found that actually, in terms of climate change, the decisions that municipalities make for their budgets or financial decisions can really impact what city officials are ultimately able to do. We found that First, it can impact the types of climate programs that can get implemented in cities. So cities, for example, would be more likely to prefer to implement programs that are profitable and that have some savings involved. And a lot of the times, things like resilience or adaptation are seen like where there's no money in that. Maybe there's savings in the future, maybe we'll have a little less damage if there's another storm, but that's less exciting for the financial people than, oh, we're gonna replace this heater with new electric heat pump and we'll have these savings in 2 years. So that's one. And then also, how you get money can impact when and for how long you're actually able to implement a program, from budgeting cycles to grants that say you have to spend all your money by X day, or you can only spend it on this geography and you cannot spend money that could possibly be in another community that it's your neighbor. And then it shifts power to decide what is worth investing in our community. So instead of municipal budgets, instead of looking at their community and seeing what are you prioritizing, what do you need, they also need to be thinking about, well, what do credit agencies prefer? What will investors want to see in our municipal bonds? So in that way, it shifts a bit of power to decide, well, what is worth investing in, when, how, and for whom.
Thinking about multiple budget cycles and how climate action has to be sustained over many, many years and often many budget cycles. I'm curious if either of you, Brianna or Kari, have experience with managing, we need to continue this beyond this budget cycle, or when it was a struggle or when it was a success.
There's no money in this for us as a long-term recovery group, right? We're basically a vehicle that is trying to disperse funding on behalf of individual survivors in our communities that have been impacted. And the real money in disaster recovery goes to these huge national organizations like the Red Cross or the Methodist Church, et cetera, who have years of coming into disaster impacted communities and getting these hundreds, millions of dollar grants to like staff up capacity-wise, right? And do these rebuilding projects as part of their ministry work and whatnot. And that's a wonderful resource to have, but it's not embedded in our community. It's this external resource that comes in, saves the day, and then leaves. So sustainability of these efforts, it's called long-term recovery for a reason, right? This is like a 5-year process, and the chance, at least, that's actually, it's probably gonna be more than that for our communities. And that's a bitter pill to swallow because people are suffering right now, and they've been suffering since July. So you never feel like you're moving fast enough. But where do we go for the next event that is sure to happen between now and when our survivors from the July flooding recover, right? So it's constantly being on the lookout for grant opportunities and partnerships who might have some resources to bring to the table to help our capacity, but it's a never-ending process. I wish there was a different way. I don't know what it is.
Actually, I want to turn to equity here. Climate change, of course, affects people in the same community quite differently, and members of a community may disagree on which issues to prioritize. Claudia, can you give us a clear example of what climate inequity might look like and an example of a justice-minded solution?
Sure. I think we don't have to go very far to notice climate injustice or climate inequity within our towns and cities. So thinking specifically about climate change, for example, a heat event, or when we have just a very, very hot day, we all experience it very differently depending on our circumstances. So it's not gonna be the same to experience a heat wave if you work an office job and you're on the AC all day versus you perhaps have a work outdoors, or if you're even on a house. So just that single day in one single event, our experiences are gonna be tremendously differently. Or even where our houses are located, do we have access to green space? Do we have access to air conditioning? And all of these issues of access come from, structural injustices in our communities, from environmental racism, colonialisms, and so on. So we are not all starting from the same place. So climate change is not an equalizer where, oh, well, we all suffer from climate change. We will all experience rising temperatures or storms or disasters, but we're not all in the same place to recover at the same rate or to be protected from those things.
So thinking about a solution that would have justice in mind, what would be an example?
I think for a very simple example, I think the most environmental thing that people have always in mind, and people make fun of me, is like, oh, you're just planting trees. But even something as simple as that, it's like, it's not just about planting trees, but where? Where is there no access to green space right now? Thinking about who would benefit from this, and then not just going and planting trees and be like, yay, now you have trees in a park, but like, what would you like in that park? What are the services that your community is lacking? So even just switching the mindset from just like, we're coming here and we know we need more trees and we're just planting them. Well, where, how, why, and what other services do you need? Going to the community first.
When it comes to the coast, of course, erosion and sea level rise are a huge issue. I myself grew up on Nantucket Island off of Cape Cod, which obviously has a lot of vacation homes, a lot of wealth, but also sea level rise is a risk to critical infrastructure and to the working class community as well. It's always this dance where there are tensions around which areas that we as a community are going to prioritize to try to protect, and the dynamics of wealth and power and inequity are at play. Brianna, in Hampton, also on the coast, how do you as a community decide which projects to prioritize? Where does that conversation happen?
It's a really, really challenging question that we deal with all of the time. And I was thinking as Kari and Claudia were talking that when we do prioritize solutions, we do try to solicit input from community members, from partnering organizations, and we want to make sure that the solutions we're pursuing are mindful of all those that are affected. But sometimes the people that can make it to the table are the people that are retired, that aren't at work that day, that don't have to, bring their children, to a doctor's appointment. So being mindful of who is at the table and trying to find alternative ways to bring them into the conversation to consider what solutions might be more effective for them than we might realize and unintentionally cause harm through the solutions that we do prioritize. I don't know that we have I can't tell you a system that we use to make sure that that's happening all of the time and that we're making the best choices with our prioritization, but it's an ongoing practice, and we're constantly working to invite more people to the table and open that conversation up and find new avenues to solicit feedback and questions and concerns. It really is an ever-evolving practice for our town.
That reminds me of something in your research, Claudia, about you found that more public engagement in climate planning is associated with greater attention to justice. So I love that synchronicity there. Cabell in Boston asks, what do you think of New York and New Jersey's plan to relocate homeowners and renters along coasts? I know that buyouts is a question that we'll touch on in each region here, but again in Hampton, Brianna, your town has been exploring at least the possibility or starting the conversation of a buyout program, right?
Yes, yeah, we have. Exploring FEMA's procedures and FEMA funding is a challenge in and of itself, and we've spent a lot of time doing that to make sure that when we roll out this program, it's as effective as it can be, and we're not, again, inadvertently causing harm. Relocating people is a really, really nuanced challenge, and there's a lot of there's a huge toll that it can play on somebody mentally. The sense of place is so important, sense of belonging, like Kari was talking about, sense of community. So there's a lot that goes into that, and we've really been exploring that very thoroughly before we begin to roll that out. But as part of that same program, FEMA funds home elevations and they provide financial assistance for home elevations. And so that's going to be kind of our first step in that program to help us, no pun intended, get our feet wet, but it will help us get familiar with the program and the needs that people have as they apply for this kind of financial assistance. And hopefully we're planning on rolling that out this year and piloting a home elevation application, and we'll see where that program takes us into the future. But there's been a lot of interest among our residents. We put out a survey, and 13 people were interested, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you really think about a coastal community and 13 people being ready and willing to relocate, to have their property acquired as soon as the funding is available, that seems pretty significant to me. And there was, I think, 60 something people that were interested in that possibility if they learn more information, down the line. But
out of around 200, right? A little over 200.
Yeah. So there's definitely interest, and it's certainly something that we're actively working to roll out, but it'll be interesting to see kind of where it lands culturally in the community.
Kari, what about buyouts in the Northeast Kingdom?
Yeah, so Brianna, you were saying that it's a difficult process, can be a difficult process, right? I mean, I think it's traumatic. I would say traumatic, even if it all goes well, right? This dislocation. So it's confusing. There's a lot of apprehension, even if it's really, in some circumstances that I can think of, the only real option. It's still incredibly scary, and there's not a lot of choice in terms of where you're going to be relocated. We don't have just vacant, empty properties. We have a housing crisis. So the chances of you ending up in a home in your community are zip.
What
Nothing.
are ways to make it less scary? Are there ways to make it less scary?
Well, I think having the opportunity to just let people process that sort of fear and their particular circumstance and situation, instead of trying to talk them out of how they're feeling, right? Just letting people have time and space, and being alongside them and letting them just talk about it, I think has been the only thing that we have found to be useful, because it's confusing to us too. Even if we're able to sort of pour through the literature and the process and maybe make that a little bit easier to understand, that doesn't take away the trauma and the fear.
It's happening in community,
Yeah.
is what you're saying.
Yes.
Were you trying to say something, Claudia? I thought I saw you moving about buyouts.
Well, and related to this conversation, I think it made me think of this contradiction that exists, again, related to climate finance and resilience, because in a lot of municipalities, for example, in Massachusetts, a lot of our municipalities rely on property taxes to be able to fund city services, including the way that we do climate resilience programs. And so we need that money to protect ourselves from the coast or from storms or from heat. But at the same time, towns and cities are incentivized to allow development to continue in areas that we know are vulnerable to climate change. And there's been a lot of research, not by me, by, for example, Professor Linda Chi from Cornell, of how coastal towns in Massachusetts still continue to have development in areas that we know are gonna flood very soon, but we need those property taxes to be able to fund climate resilience in the first place. And we have been, there has been research of that happening also in Miami, for example, where they're allowing a lot of development of high luxury buildings in areas that we know are gonna flood. But again, we need that for money to be able to then respond to that. So who gets to stay in the coast and how? That's the question.
Let's talk about how to get people involved and how to rally people to stay involved. Beyond voting, an important topic, but beyond voting, as we mentioned earlier, Claudia, in your research, this idea of public engagement in climate planning is associated with a greater attention to justice. So if you're a citizen and you're starting from outside of politics, you want to see more climate action in your city, how do you start? What are specific offices or committees or people that you can look for?
I would encourage people to actually look at their budgets and figure out who makes those decisions and how can you influence those decisions in the future. There's no standards for municipal budgets, so almost every town it's different, and the documents will look differently and decisions are made differently, so I would encourage you to figure out how that works where you live.
Get into those budgets. Yeah. Brianna, as a conservation coordinator, how do residents help you do your job? When people approach you, what do you like to see and what do you wish you saw more of?
My work is so driven by resident input. I love when people come and ask questions about what they can or should not do on their property, because I think stewarding your own property responsibly is such an important first step in breaking down the barrier between you and the world around you, the natural world around you, and finding ways to do that well. Even just not mowing your grass is short, is like just making those simple decisions to really connect with your natural world through your own backyard, or through the park in your neighborhood, or through whatever green space you have access to, is really a super important first step. And then I think residents who are monitoring their communities and their natural spaces and reporting back to me on what they're seeing is, I can't put a weight on how important that is. There are lifelong residents who have been monitoring the size of the dunes by their homes for 30 years and have photo evidence of how these dunes have changed and evolved. And it's not official data collection, but it ultimately becomes that and how we're using it. And so the residents who are really paying attention and trying to learn how to better pay attention to their natural world and again break down that barrier between them as a human and the outside world, and coming to me or many of the different offices in our town office with those questions and concerns. And any public town meeting, those are great avenues for that kind of work and that kind of dialogue.
Susan in Durham says, have we abandoned efforts to reverse climate change? Is adaptation our only focus now? Claudia, what do you think?
Well, all of my life is about mitigations these days. So we're still working on climate mitigation, and that's still critical. I think they are both one of sides of the same coin. One cannot exist without the other, and in many ways they can both support each other, and we need to see them. Well, resilience, mitigation, and justice all as one and not as these separate things with separate people and separate departments.
I'm thinking about low-hanging fruit or something that could be done on a local level that if your city or town has not done it, they should do it. They should think and see if it's been done in their town. I'm thinking about something in a building code, maybe something on a town energy council. What would be something that they should check to see if their town has taken care of this aspect of climate action?
I think one would be, is there any person in the city whose job description include climate change? And maybe if your town is not small or it doesn't have the resources to have its own sustainability or environment or climate department, has climate been integrated into the departments that exist? So you probably have a parks department or public works, and all of those departments that do classic city services have so much influence on climate action at the city level. So I would encourage people, is anyone thinking about this in my town on their daily responsibilities? And then the other thing I would think about is there any way that community engagement or oversight over climate programs has been integrated or formalized in any way? So in that way, we guarantee that there is some sort of community oversight every year, no matter what happens with city staff, no matter the turnover within the department, there's gonna be a community voice there. So thinking about, is there any way that community engagement or oversight has been formalized in the way that climate work is done in your community?
Sustaining this work, do you have any examples of things that people have done that have made a big difference in morale in terms of climate action?
And I can't help but underscore this is relational work. We are humans that are meant to live in relationship with one another and our environment. And when that is out of balance, or if that's that's not a reciprocal relationship, or a relationship, quite frankly, built on love, then you're going to feel it. And those crises are going to be an actual crisis rather than a road bump.
Thank you so much. This is a great place, I think, to wrap up. Thank you to Brianna, Claudia, and Kari for joining me today, and thank you so much to our beautiful audience joining us in the room.
You are watching the By Degrees Climate Summit, produced by NHPR in collaboration with NHPBS. Stay tuned for the second panel, featuring climate reporters discussing the role solutions-based journalism can play in affecting community action and accountability.
Well, welcome to today's second panel. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for coming back. I'm Rick Ganley, host of NHPR's Morning Edition. Earlier, we heard from experts who are working to make their communities more resilient to the effects of climate change, and now we're going to be spending some time with the people who cover our communities, our towns, and our cities, working to bring important information about the environment and the changing climate to the broader public. So joining us are 4 journalists who bring a really broad amount of coverage to solutions-based journalism, climate coverage, to help our communities through this. Thank you all for joining us. Maura Hoplamazian covers climate change, energy, and the environment for NHPR. My colleague in the newsroom sits just 10 feet away from me. A pleasure. Maura also helps lead our By Degrees climate reporting project that tells stories of the people grappling with the challenges of our changing world and exploring possible solutions. Neela Banerjee is the Chief Climate Desk Editor for NPR. The Climate Desk at NPR focuses on making complex science accessible to audiences, spotlighting barriers to addressing climate change, and explaining solutions and revealing how climate change has disproportionately affected marginalized people. And we're really happy to have you here, Neela. Thank you. Paula Mora is an independent audio reporter in New England. She was formerly a reporter on WBOR's Climate and Environment team, where she covered local communities' resilience to climate change. Welcome. And Abigail Giles covers climate and the environment for Vermont Public. She focuses on the energy transition and how the climate crisis is affecting Vermonters and Vermont's landscape in particular. Welcome. So great to have all of you on stage here. I've enjoyed all of your reporting over the years. And I actually want to start with a question that we did get from the audience that came up in our last panel. And I think this is a great kind of a bridge question to this panel. So let's put this to you. Susan from Durham asks, again, have we abandoned discussions of ways to reverse climate change? Can journalism reignite that? Maura, let's start with you.
Yeah. So I think about this a lot. I think in my work as a local reporter, often what I'm covering a lot of the time is climate change impacts. If there's a weather event, if there's a study comes out, and we see sea level rises getting worse, farmers are losing crops in a rainy summer. And so I hear that, like the idea that we're focusing a lot on impact and not so much on solutions. I try really hard to cover solutions. I don't think we're ignoring it in the journalists I know. But I do think the idea of framing is really important. So in all of my stories about climate change impacts, I try to add the context that humans caused climate change and are causing climate change. The IPCC says every ton of carbon we emit matters, makes the world warmer. This is a choice, we've made and are making, and I think that context is really important from a solutions lens. And then, of course, covering climate solutions, not just covering them, but bringing the journalistic rigor we bring to everything else, to those solution stories. Who's funding these? Who's benefiting from them? Who's losing out? Is there greenwashing happening? So yeah, I guess that's sort of how I think about solutions, but I'm sure these other journalists have.
Well, that speaks to, you don't want tune out. You don't want to turn people off. You want to give them something, some kind of hopeful reporting as well as the facts. And the facts can be very dark. Abigail, from your standpoint in Vermont, I know you're reporting in the last year with incredible flooding that happened over there. Do you see that? Do you feel that journalism can offer climate solutions that people are paying attention to?
Yeah, I think so. And I think on the topic of kind of like fatigue and the sort of desire to tune out, something that I find very reassuring is that whenever we do polling of our audiences, our audience, I should say, time and again we hear that climate and environment are some of the issues that matter most to them, and in particular around solutions and accountability reporting that happens at the very local level. So I think that there's a critical and important role for local reporters to play, in particular in this space. You know, not every newsroom can staff a full-time climate reporter in the local news world. I'm one of 2 climate reporters in our state. And, you know, I think that there's a real service that we can provide by, like Mara spoke to, doing really diligent reporting, fact-checking, looking for greenwashing, and kind of, I like to think of it as providing the tools for constructive debate so that communities and people in communities have good information about how to engage on this issue, which really does affect all of us and some of us disproportionately.
Yeah. Neela, when setting the editorial strategy for NPR's Climate Desk, how much weight do you give stories that are focused on solutions? I know your team hired a climate solutions reporter.
So NPR is quite new to having a climate desk. Climate change was covered as a science story for a long time. And so when we got the opportunity to create a climate desk, one of our first priorities was to have a position that would look at solutions. And I think the reason is that solutions, I mean, a lot of people like to talk about hope, but I also feel like when you talk about hope, others can be dismissive of that notion and say that you're being Pollyanna. And what we like to think about is agency, right? That we have agency over what is happening in the world. And I just want to go back to that question that Susan asked in the previous thing about, like, if you're talking about solutions, if you're talking about adapting, does that mean that you're giving up on reducing the pollution that's driving climate change? When we work on solutions, you know, both at the network and then with our partners at member stations, like, you know, and we work with all 3 of these reporters, right? We're looking at solutions that reduce the pollution that's making the planet hotter, and also that help us adapt. Because as a lot of you know, if we turned off all greenhouse gas emissions now, that carbon dioxide is still baked into our atmosphere and the planet would continue to heat. So what we're fighting for is for every 1/10 of a degree not to make it worse. Because if this is what it looks like right now, 1.1, it beggars the imagination what it's going to look like at 1.5 or 2, right? So that is what the battle is about. It's about adapting to what's happening now and preventing it from getting worse. We do that through a solutions reporter who is wonderful. Unfortunately, she's like one person doing the job of like 4 people at the Washington Post, right? And she does everything from looking at, I mean, she's done stories that were really popular that really break it down for our audience. Like, what is a climate solution, you know? And how do you, as regular people, figure out like what's real and what's not? So that was one of our most popular stories last year. But also when reporters are writing about things that aren't firmly in the solution space, right? They don't just write about the problems, but they write about how we can address them. So for example, our Climate and Corporations reporter, Michael Copley, he's been writing a lot about plastics recently because the fossil fuel industry sees petrochemicals as a way to keep producing and keep adding to their bottom line, even as EVs and renewable energy and all of that drive down use of it as fuel. So plastics are everywhere. It's an issue. How do we deal with it? And so one of the things he's looking at is this treaty about this global treaty that's being negotiated to reduce plastics, right? And the discussions around that and who's in the way of that. So we find through our audiences that they really like solution stories, but they also like, a fact check, like a gut check through accountability. And they really like science that pertains to their lives. And all of these things, I think, are woven together. So that's how we do it. It's not just Julia, our solutions reporter, but every reporter, when they're doing stories, they're not just like laying out a problem for you and then you're miserable. They're also like, telling you what is the solution here and what's the barrier? Is it political will? Is it lobbying? Is it science? What is the barrier here, or some combination?
Paula, could solutions-based stories potentially help with audience fatigue, you think?
I think so. What I see, also echoing what Neela was saying, like it gives to the communities and to the readers and listeners the sense of agency, especially when you go to a community and you are covering a climate solution that was thought for many, many months, everyone together, like people, some NGO, the municipality, and other groups all try to bring everyone to the table. I've covered some solutions that were like this in Massachusetts, for example, doing research of what people really need, what they are concerned about. So this really make people feel their say will turn into something that will help their lives. And I was also looking at the Reuters Institute report on digital news, and they found that even people who say they avoid the news because they are fatigued or because they can't see more tragedy or anything like that, they are interested in solution stories. So both people who read the news and are tired and people who totally say they avoid the news, they are interested in solution stories.
I think that brings up a question about climate journalism being perceived as being ideological. Nate from Nottingham asked us a question about that. It's clear that climate journalism is often perceived as ideological, what means that many people just frankly tune out. Everybody's in their own echo chamber. So how do we as journalists think about that challenge? Does reaching those who are alienated by much of climate reporting factor into your work? How about you, Mara?
Yeah, I'm for sure familiar with that perception. Something that I think guides me and grounds me in that is that I feel like climate change is maybe one of the few things that we all experience, like we truly have a shared experience of, and whether people are having that experience with shorter ice fishing seasons or experiencing more heat in their workplace. Their dog has like a ton of ticks on it in the summertime. We all have some sort of personal connection. It's affecting our lives in some way, and I think connecting with that helps me think about how to connect with people who see it as an ideological issue, because it sort of allows that personal connection to come through and allows us to think about why we care about living on Earth and why we might care about climate change. I also think understanding why people who see it as an ideological issue do see it as an ideological issue is really important, and sort of getting a sense for why people believe what they believe, why they may not believe in the reality of climate change, what's stopping them from incorporating that understanding into their work and their life. That's a journalistic question I'm really interested in, and I think just sort of I don't necessarily see my job as to change people's minds, but to connect with what reality they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talk about this all the time, and Amar and I talked about this all the time. The ski season shrinking in New Hampshire. It's obviously a big tourism state, recreation a big business. So there are ways to talk to people in the business community that might be at a more conservative end of the spectrum when you're talking about climate change. Abigail, do you see that in Vermont as well?
Yeah, something I heard, I think, from a former editor was, people might not use the language of climate change, but everybody in Vermont likes to talk about the weather. And that's something I found as a reporter. I was an agriculture reporter before I was a climate reporter. And I met plenty of people who are farmers who would tell me, I have seen change in the way that my family farm and the resources that I kind of tend to, the way that they sort of manifest, the way that my business runs in recent decades. And they might not be using the language of climate change in some cases, although we have many farmers in our state who are huge proponents of climate action and do a lot of advocacy. But I think that there's a lot of power in climate stories, whether it's after a natural disaster or just about trying to sort of understand what it means to find resilience and to adapt to this future that it's our present reality. Especially in small communities, there's so much to be said, I think, for hearing your neighbor's voice on the radio and just feeling seen and kind of remembering that these changes are things that all of us are experiencing. I think, you know, in northern New England, people are so connected to the landscape. We love where we live. You know, I talked to a youth advocate actually this morning who told me when he feels tired, he goes and sits by the river behind his house. And I love that. I think that that's something that we can all identify with. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of start with the place of like, what is our shared reality and our shared experience of this place that we are invested in together because it's where we live. And I also think too, there's, you know, as was spoken to by everybody earlier, I find that letting the science drive the stories we tell is hugely important as well. You know, there's a lot to be concerned about, but I think that the science also tells us very clearly that there's still time to make different choices, that there is a window through which we can take action to make the future that we inherit better. And so I think that, you know, ideology is one thing, but as reporters, I do think it's important for us to help people to better understand the science and make sure our reporting is grounded very carefully in what we know and what we don't know.
No, a number of stations around the region, NHPR included, work together through the New England News Collaborative. Maura, how's that been working out for us?
Well, I love collaborating. I mean, I know all of these people through collaborations.
And we love having them. I mean, it's great. Like, I'm so glad to be here because of the people who are on the stage. They're great.
Yeah, I've had just like, I think it's really transformed how I think about my job as a reporter because I get to see really amazing reporters do stories and then feel ambitious myself about the kind of reporting I want to do. Particularly in New England, I mean, we experience really similar climate impacts across the region, but our states handle it in really different ways, policy-wise. And in New Hampshire in particular, it's really helpful for me to have points of comparison, you know, how are other state legislatures handling these problems, and you know, how is New Hampshire's approach different? And then, you know, that allows us sort of the long view as we look into the future. How are those policies working out? You know, like how are people in these states that are handling climate change really differently experiencing those policy differences?
Let's turn now to some examples of the kinds of solutions-based stories that we've been talking about today. Abigail, let me start with you because this is kind of breaking news. Vermont Governor Phil Scott has just vetoed a bill that would require the state to source all of its energy from renewable sources by 2035. This was passed by Vermont lawmakers. What has been the arguments for it?
I think, interestingly, the sort of controversy around this policy is not about whether or not Vermont should go to 100% renewable power. Actually, every utility in the state supports this bill, and along with, you know, renewable developers, I think, as you would expect, and most environmental groups in the state. But where the sort of kind of sticking point, I think, between the governor and lawmakers has been is over how to get there. Essentially, this policy would quadruple the amount of new renewable power that Vermont utilities purchase from the New England region. And, you know, essentially why that sort of matters from an emissions perspective is that we have an interconnected grid. So Vermont is absolutely dependent on natural gas burned elsewhere in the region. We are heavily dependent on nuclear power. And by and large, that isn't generated within our borders. We, of course, draw a lot of power from Hydro-Quebec as well. So essentially, in order to sort of offset the fossil fuel dependence in our electric sector as a region, investing in new renewables is really the sort of way to do that. You know, lots of also important factors there around where they're sited, where, you know, whether it's where there's demand and storage. The long and short of it is, I think there's agreement, interestingly, in Vermont that we need to get to this goal. There's just disagreement about how to do it in the most cost-effective way.
Maura, you've done a lot of reporting on the move towards community power here in New Hampshire in particular. How is it changing the state's energy landscape?
You know, I think with community power in New Hampshire, it's pretty new. I don't know. For me, it seems sort of too early to say how exactly it's changing our electric or our energy system, but something that I've experienced talking to folks in towns, I think more than now 60 towns who either have adopted community power programs or are in the process of adopting them, is just that so many more people are interested in how we get our energy and how their homes are powered, and are taking the steps to go to town meeting, to learn about it, to look at their electric bill, and to sort of care about like how we get our power, which I think, especially with energy, you know, I started as a climate reporter with no energy background. I like took Dartmouth's Energy 101 YouTube class to like understand how to report on it. And it can be really scary, like it can be really opaque. And I think the fact that community power has gotten so many people involved in understanding how the electric system works is really interesting and something that is transformational. Community power providers also say, you know, this system can help us adopt more renewables in the state. I think that's something I'm really interested in learning more about, watching it sort of play out as it goes along. So, yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit more about our region here. You know, New England particularly affected by flooding, as we've seen in the past year and a half. We're seeing the heaviest increase in flood events than anywhere else in the country. Many communities hit hard last summer, especially in Vermont. Abigail, you reported extensively on those floods. How did you see communities come together in the aftermath of that?
We saw these sort of small pockets of like very real-time solutions work happening with minimal resources, just because people saw an opportunity to do something for somebody else and they did it. Those are stories that to me as a reporter need to be told. Like we need to hear each other, and we need to hear that even in these moments of terrible despair, I think there's great opportunity for hope.
Well, Mara, you've done an awful lot of reporting on flooding here in New Hampshire as well. You have a piece up this week, a fantastic piece about flooding that happened about 6 months ago, the storms in December, in particular about people who have been flooded out of their homes and trying to get help, promised help. How are towns and cities in the North Country, you know, working to become more resilient when it comes to flooding like this?
You know, towns I talked to, particularly the town of Conway, has a sort of Band-Aid approach for this. There's part of town that gets cut off on both sides by flooding, so it becomes sort of like an island. And for the past many storms, they've just stationed an ambulance and a fire truck in that part of town before it starts raining, so that people in that place that becomes sort of an island, this neighborhood, have access to medical care if they're, you know, can't get out of their neighborhood for a couple days. And that town, you know, there's this Band-Aid solution, but now they're sort of trying to get federal help to raise the roads that flood out and create culverts and drainage. It poses a money question because it's, you know, even if they get 90% of the project funded, it's still, you know, a tax hike for folks in town and requires voter input and buy-in. So, yeah, I think places are trying to become more resilient and also struggling with the money side of things.
Yeah, Neela, do you see that? I see you nodding your head too. Do you see that when you're in national reporting for NPR, that towns and cities are, you know, trying certain things, but of course it comes down to money?
There is money becoming available. It might not be enough, but you also have to have leaders in your communities who are willing to look at what the science is saying about what could happen in their community, what's already happening, because the past is no longer precedent, right? And you know, and then I think it's incumbent upon your representatives, your governors, your AGs to push either on the local level or on the federal level to get the money to, you know, to build this resilience. So that's, you know, that's at the end of the day, I mean, this country has the money to do it, right? The question is whether we're going to do it.
We do have an audience question here, and this that goes right to the heart of what we have this panel for today. How do you express urgency and alarm without falling into despair, excuse me?
I think it's a responsibility of journalists to make sure that we are telling stories that center the perspectives of people and communities who are bearing the worst impacts of climate change, and amplify their voices, amplify the solutions that they're bringing forward. And you know, I think that's one answer to that question, is that sort of work. But on the flip side, you know, I do think that there's a degree to which, you know, we live in a time where there is unprecedented federal funding for this kind of work that's out there. So it's just a matter of whether states and communities are going to be able to go get it, and if they're going to do that. So, yeah.
How about you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think if we stick to the science and to the facts, and as Abigail said, like interview the people who are living it, we can bring a very accurate picture that then people can decide and work with that we bring. Like if we do good journalism, it will be a way to help people to understand the reality and not go like for something sensationalist. And I also wanted to go back to one thing that Nila said. The people in Reading, in the Mystic River, which by the way is the most urbanized area in New England, which is most paved and less absorption of water in the rain, they hope to reduce flood damage. They don't even hope to reduce flooding. So that was something that struck me, that they said we're not even thinking about reducing flooding or ending flooding. It's just like the damage that we hope to reduce.
Neela, how does that play into the selection of stories that you do for NPR?
The science is the absolute foundation of everything. We are not going to get over our skis on this, right? It has to be, and if you're coming up with a solution, like, is it not just like scientifically plausible? Is it scalable? Is it affordable? All of this stuff. And I think in approaching it this way, a lot of times we do get asked as climate reporters, including like by my friends or whatever, like, how do you do it? Don't you get like depressed? And I don't, because I do feel like everybody on this stage, that we hope that we are helping the public, right? We hope that we're giving you information to have that sense of agency and clarity. And and I think a lot of times people, like regular people who are not journalists, feel despair because they feel like I'm so small, I can't do anything. And you're not small. You have, yes, like big corporations, big governments got us to this point, right? But we are, like Mara was saying, like communities have come together before to do things. And one of the solutions that we actually came, like experts told us last year when Julia Simon said, what is a climate solution? Talked about scalability, affordability. She said, one of the solutions that people have is your vote. Right? People are saying this now. It is not a partisan issue. There are places in this country that's one party or another. But the example she used was Brazil, right? You had, Bolsonaro, and there was terrible deforestation there. They elected Lula, and deforestation has plummeted and that is how people's votes matter. So these are the things, that we can point out, and then it's up to people to make those decisions. And I think that's what prevents despair. And I think the reporters on our team understand that, and they support each other, and they have colleagues, at member stations with whom they're in constant communication, and find a way to support each other that way too.
Well, I appreciate that there's a panel of environmental journalists on the stage who have hope, because you have to have hope, I think, in order to offer hope. So as journalists, it's heartening to hear. Well, I want to thank you all for coming here on stage, and thank you in the audience as well. Thank you to our virtual audience today. I want to thank UNH for hosting, gracious hosts indeed, and thank you to all the staff at NHPR as always, and NHPBS teams that made this all possible, the tech teams, behind-the-scenes teams, the producers, the editors. It takes an awful lot to pull off an event like this, and I think they deserve a round of applause, so thank you.